We're live. Welcome tonight, Tuesday night, and we're glad you're joining us. If you are, in fact, joining us for the first time, welcome, special welcome to you. We're glad you're here. We invite you, as always, this is an open forum type podcast. The way that this works is I ask questions based on a topic that I've chosen, and Pastor Ford, who's the pastor here at the Door Christian Fellowship Church in San Carlos, answers those questions from the hip, from the heart. It's live, unrehearsed. And so, in that nature, we ask you to ask your questions as well. Invite you to be free. Try not to be rude. Sometimes we have people throw comments or questions on there that are purely just to mess around. We ask for your serious questions. If your questions come from the heart, the answers will come from the heart as well. So tonight we're talking about truth again. This is basically a part 2 from last week, but I didn't want to just have a whole bunch of repeat, and so I really I tried to be careful about covering a sufficient amount of ground. Last week was a lot of questions, and the topic kind of stayed on my initial point, which is great. But we still want to talk more about truth, because Jesus said, and this is what kind of spurred this topic in the first place, is Jesus said that this was actually the reason why he came to the earth, to bear witness to or testify of the truth. And so that seems pretty important. If that was, and by the way, I think that was the last, we'll call it normal conversation Jesus had before he was actually nailed to a cross. So some of his last words, some of his last recorded words in the day or so leading up to his crucifixion was this conversation with a guy named Pilate, who was a Roman, what was he, like a general, or I can't even remember what his governor. Yeah, there you go. He was basically governing this group of this city of Jewish people, and he himself was not a Jew, and so he asks Jesus the question, are you a king? And then Jesus says, are you asking this for yourself, or has somebody told you this about me? And then Jesus answers the question by saying that all who hear me, or all who are of the truth, hear my voice. And so this whole dynamic really it's caught my attention. And so I hope to kind of bring that level of curiosity out in this podcast, is that if Jesus says something like that, and he says that, first off, this is the reason I came to the earth. Second off, anyone who is of the truth hears me. And there are a lot of bold statements. I think I'm going to probably work on another podcast talking about the bold statements Jesus made. We could probably have several of them, actually, and kind of hashing some of that out. But tonight, specifically, such a statement, this idea of truth. But when he asked Pilate, are you asking this for yourself, or did somebody else tell you this about me? It's almost like he's asking Pilate if he wants to know the truth. And so that's what kind of led to this topic title, Do You Want the Truth? And so I had a quote from last week, because Monday of last week was Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And then we actually just didn't get to that part. So I'm going to quote it now, but this is something he said while he was in school. He wrote in the school newspaper, he said, education must enable one to sift and weigh evidence, to discern the true from the false, the real from the unreal, and the facts from the fiction. He wrote this in 1947. Now, granted, he had a Christian background, and so he's a man that thinks like this, and he showed that in the way that he, spoke in front of thousands of people, and that was, you could see this kind of theme in the way he thought about things. He didn't think about things in a biased perspective, or from a biased perspective. He thought about things from the standpoint of what's the truth. Mm-hmm. And so that's a different way of thinking. If you have a lot of conversations with people, do you think that that's a common way of thinking, especially in the United States? Do you think people think like that, like think from a neutral perspective often?
Well, I just finished a book which I thought was very interesting, and it's called The Myth of Normal. And so I'm very sensitive.
You're smashing through books right now, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm
Every time I talk to you,
yeah,
listen to a new one.
So the idea of common, I don't think is so common anymore. I've begun to really think about, more deeply. people's experience, and what would be considered common may not be. And that's really the whole point of the book. Is the book is bringing out the ideas what we think is common is not as common as we might think it is. And so I wouldn't want to try to generalize how most people think.
Right.
That so from that standpoint, but I do think that there are classifications of people. You have people that are feelers and people who are thinkers, and I think that how we think has a lot to do with the relationship between those two things. People who, like myself, are more thinkers than feelers, usually gravitate towards that kind of thing of analyzing and that kind of thing. But then people that are more feelers are, they kind of, the tendency is to make more quick judgments, jump to conclusions, those kinds of things. And so it's hard to try to define that.
So this idea of thinkers versus feelers, what do you think? Let's just talk generally then. What, how do feelers process things, generally speaking?
Based on experience. So everything is all experience based, and that's the idea of that's why one isn't wrong and the other one right, because it's just simply a mode of operation. But there has to be, I think, so for people who are the more thinker type people, it's a little easier to keep from jumping to conclusions and things like that, where the person who's more emotionally based has to maybe work a little bit harder, when it comes to processing things.
So what do you think is like, between the two, what are like the pros and cons of each, the thinker and the feeler?
The
Or,
well,
or I
can
wish
talk.
it's like talk about maybe the pros and cons of being too extreme in either direction. Because I mean, you can't just be a feeler, right? You have
Yeah,
to think about things.
no, and nobody is just anything. I mean, obviously is an overlap. It's not, there aren't people that just don't think. It's not like that, or people who just don't feel.
Yeah.
It's not like that. It's just which is the more dominant trait in their lives. And when it comes to truth, that bent has pros and cons in both directions, because um, the intellectual or the thinker can err on the side of rational conclusion.
Mhm.
Which is funny, because you have to be careful with this, because and as a thinker, this is my thing I always have to be careful of, is that you can start processing data, and then you can come to a conclusion, but your conclusion can be completely wrong because of a lack of data. And so you have to be careful that you don't think that you have all the data. And there's a similar example of that when it comes to the feeling side of things. Is you can jump to a conclusion because you have a feeling about it. You've been processing information, and it's led you to this feel, and so it's the same idea. It's the same thing. You could still be lacking data. When you think about either one of those ideas, like in a relationship, somebody tells you that somebody doesn't like you. You didn't hear it from their mouth. Somebody else told you. And so, as a feeler, you're going to rely on how you feel the sympathy of that individual is with you. If this is a person that's not very sympathetic with you, then you might think, oh, you're just talking garbage, because you don't already jive with these people. There's not already that sort of camaraderie of feel. But it's also the same thing with the thinking, is that if there's not that camaraderie of thinking, then you'll question what was given. And so both of them have they have their advantages and disadvantages.
Mm.
One isn't an advantage over the other until you get to the issue of extremes, and that is where the issue is. And so people who live by their feelings, and then if they hear that somebody doesn't like them, then they act on that. They just act on that regardless of anything else. Doesn't matter if an enemy told them that. They'll just latch onto it because they're feelers, and that's their whole focus, is that if somebody doesn't like me, I don't like them, and that's all there is to it. Even if you don't know whether they like you or not. But then you also have the same thing, is the ability of, in your mind, okay, well, they don't like me, well, then they're dead to me. As a thinker, you're not going to give them the time of day. You disconnect yourself mentally. You do all kinds of things, and so both of them have their problems. So it's the extremes where you have trouble being able to get to the truth, because at some point you're going to either jump to a conclusion on the basis of skipping the steps of investigation, whether that's feeling or thinking. So you have to be careful with that, because your feelings can lie to you and your thoughts may be insufficient. You may have insufficient information.
Okay, Brian's asking, do you think less grounded feelers may even be the minority, although they seem to be a huge group but are more vocal than thinkers?
Again, that's the kind of thing that is just subject to speculation. You can't. How do you judge something like that? I mean, there isn't even a place you can go to get that kind of data. Because you go to one news station, and they'll tell you this, and then you go to another news station, and they'll tell you just the opposite. And so there's no real place. I mean, the statistics can help. Like there are research groups, and you can read statistics, how people answer questions and things like that can give you a feel about things. But certainly, I wouldn't say that all feelers are vocal. I actually would offer the possibility that what makes somebody a vocal is their personality, whether they're introverted or extroverted, as opposed to whether they're a feeler or a thinker. Because you can have, you have thinkers that love the limelight, and I won't name any names, but people who would claim, who they thrive on that because they're extroverted, and so they'll talk really loud. But then you have other people that just don't thrive there, and so they'd rather not. But they can still be feelers, and the kind of people that, think nobody likes them.
Yeah.
So they don't go to parties, they don't go here, they don't go there, So it's a mixed bag. It could go either way.
Yeah. Karina's asking she asked this question while you were kind of already explaining this, but I'll ask it anyway, just in case you want to clarify or give a little bit more detail on it. But can you give an example of a thinker and a feeler?
Right. Yeah, I did do that, I think. Yeah.
Anything to add? Do you think it's sufficient?
Well, yeah. I mean, the main issues, like I said, is that the thinker is using mental processes of rationale, logic, those kinds of things, where the feeler is more based on the emotional level. How, do they get angry? Do they get upset? It's more from that standpoint, the emotional.
So zoom out a little bit. Martin Luther King Jr. Said education must enable, which is an interesting thought. And so maybe not zooming so far into education itself, but thinking more from like a societal level. How do you think, our culture or society in general, maybe even from a world perspective, supports or resists the pursuit of truth? Do you think that there's like a genuine culture of curiosity towards truth, or do you think that there's a bent in another direction?
Well, I would, from the biblical point of view, the Bible shows us that man is prone to lies. That topic comes up a lot.
Yeah.
Of being deceived. Paul says it even in his letters to Christians. He's saying, "Don't be deceived." So there is a tendency to believe lies, and we know the Bible tells us that the devil propagates lies, and so the issue of lies and truths, again, I think comes down to a mixed bag. But there are forces that oppose truth, and there are people that claim personal truth, which is a that's an opposition to truth, because if you're making truth claims, just based on your own personal opinions or experiences, then you're not really interested in truth. Truth is what you think it is.
Yeah. So individually, you're saying that we have both external and internal calm forces, like against truth.
Well, I would, if you, so here's, I think, again, from a biblical perspective, this is the conclusion, is that God created us for truth. Like what Jesus said to Pilate, those who are interested in truth will hear me. And so there are, there is a basis, inside of us for truth. It's just that sometimes truth is, to quote, what's his name, former vice president.
Oh gosh,
what was his name? The Inconvenient Truth. He wrote the book Inconvenient Truth. Been a while. Anyway, it'll come up in 15 seconds.
Yeah,
so, I'm sure.
I'm sure Mariah will throw it up
there. But anyway, that sometimes truth is genuine truth. Not some speculative truth or some way, because the phrase gets thrown around a lot. Inconvenient truth.
Hence,
Hal Gore. Yeah. That's who it is. And so that's the thing is that when truth becomes inconvenient, then we can believe, or we will more than likely either overcome that inconvenience, or we'll give in to and buy into a lie. So
very good. Okay, so that's, while we were talking before the podcast, I kind of had this Warren Buffett. I've had I'm kind of, I write questions down, and then I kind of have to try and sometimes fit those questions in the right places.
Yeah.
And sometimes I miss it, sometimes I get it. But I was thinking about times where, and this is as a Christian, I'm talking about as a Christian, my Christian experience. There have been times where I've either been committed to going a direction, right? And in my mind, I'm convinced it's right. I'm thinking this is the right direction to go. And, I do pray, I do ask God for direction, and have actually become a lot more dependent on that over the last few years. But allowing God to kind of, before I actually make a move, looking for an answer, and then having God actually genuinely speak to me through whether a sermon, a conversation, scripture, during prayer, whatever. There's these different forums that God uses, but then to see that the direction I was going to go was flat out wrong. Like that's not the right direction to go. And when I was putting these thoughts together, it made me think about just that idea of how genuinely convinced we can be in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
So this idea you're talking about, and I guess the way I'd form that in a question is that, how do you, is the truth mysterious?
No. No.
Is it like, is it like a picture that comes to mind? Is it like the pillow in a blindfolded pillow fight? You're just like, everybody's kind of swinging around. Eventually you get hit with it. Is that at chance?
Yeah,
How does genuine truth work? And then I want to talk a little bit more about, really zooming into what truth is, because, it seems like there's a lot more to truth than.
Well, so the Bible has a lot to say about the foundations, for truth, for balance. Life is a balance. I think that's there's a couple of foundations that well, there's a lot of foundations, but there's a couple that come to mind that I think are very important for us to understand. Is number one, everything in life is a balance. There are two extremes to everything. And this is often where we get into trouble, is because we can, and it is a deception, we can deceive ourselves into believing that if we keep going in this direction, we will ultimately strike truth. But the truth of the matter is that if we keep going in that same direction, more than likely we will pass truth. We won't strike it. We will pass it, and we will go on beyond it. That's a more realistic understanding of how human thinking works. Is because we never achieve any measure of perfection, and so we're always going to go. So we'll be going along, and we'll get up to the center, which is the real truth. And if we get excited about that and we think we're going in the right direction, well, we'll go right by it, and then we'll go off and then eventually we'll be excited about error, not about truth, because we like the direction we're going. And so that's the danger. And then the other factor in that, which you see over and over in the Bible, is that as men go from here and they're making their way towards the middle and they pass the middle and they go off to the wrong direction, God lets that happen. And so there's no stop sign, at truth. And this is a very dangerous way of thinking, is to think that there's a stop sign at truth, that as long as you're pursuing truth, you're going to eventually hit a stop sign that says go no further in this direction. No, you're going to cross it. And if you're not paying attention, you'll keep going in that direction. It's the old story of that's been mentioned, that Martin Luther, is that every Christian is like a drunken peasant. You're falling off of one side of the donkey, and then you wake up and you go back to the other side, into the middle, then you go over to the other side, and that's basically Christianity.
Martin Luther, or Martin Luther King?
Martin Luther.
Martin Luther. Okay.
And so that's kind of the way that we find truth, is you're kind of passing over it and going too far in either direction. And then the hope is as you're maturing and growing as a Christian, is those swings are becoming less and less, but they never go away. You're never just riding true. You're always going to be bouncing off the edges. And if you're learning truth, and personally, and I do emphasize personally, what I feel is the key in that is that you must have input from outside. There is wisdom, the Bible says, in the multitude of counselors. Now, the Bible doesn't just say there's wisdom in counselors. The Bible says there is wisdom in the multitude of counselors. In other words, the more counselors you have in your life, the more you're going to encounter wisdom.
Yeah.
Because you are, I like I told you, I went through Audible, and I just put in the letter A, and then checked, books that are that are part of the thing, part of the contract.
Included, yeah.
Yeah, they're included, and so they're free. And I'm scrolling hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books, and I'm looking at books, and I'm just looking at titles, and just looking. I go past all the fiction stuff. I don't have a problem with fiction. I read some fiction, but I'm trying to learn. So you fiction, one of the problems with fiction is you can't really learn anything from fiction, because it's like making up your own game with your own rules, and then you win at the end.
Yeah.
What have you learned in all that? You haven't learned anything. And so you need real life to set the boundaries. And so
balance.
Well, yeah. And so I'm just scrolling through, and I'm looking at titles. And that's how I found that book, the Myth of Normal. I thought, anything to me that catches my attention, that somehow challenges the status quo, I'll read it and get somebody else's point of view on a thing. I've read books about climate change. I've read books about wealth and prosperity, and both secular and Christian. Books about the mind and how the mind works, epigenetics, and traditional psychology, and so I can hear all kinds of people talking, and what all kinds of people have discovered. I mean, because these people have discovered, they do this for a living. They're researching this stuff. Anybody who can look at somebody who's given their entire life to something and said, "Well, that person's stupid," is stupid. Because there's just you in the true sense of the term, you are ignorant. You don't understand. If somebody's given themselves to something for years and years and years of their life, there must be some reason behind that. There must be some legitimate reason why somebody is giving themselves to that, and they're worth listening to, and at least hearing their perspective in order to be able to help you build a balance on both sides, to be able to hear both sides of an argument, whether it's Democrats and Republicans. The more I learn about Democrats and Republicans, the more I realize that they're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
No, Republicans are true. No, Democrats are true. No, they're both the same. They're both the same. They're just different sides of the same coin. They have the same motivations, the deeper motivations, the same deeper agendas. Both of them think they're helping people. Both of them think this is the right way to run the country. Both of them are functioning out of from the same deck of cards. It's just when they pick their hand just looks very, very different than the other side. But they're both in their minds playing the same game. And so the more that you are getting outside information, the better. And when I say outside, I'm not just talking about outside information that you agree with. I'm talking about just in general, reading books by people who've gotten degrees. So it was funny the way that it was said, because it was told me by somebody who's not a scholarly person, but we were in this library, this bookstore, and it was a bookstore of old books. And I said, there were so many different authors I'd never heard of before. They're all Christians from 1800s. And I asked, I said, so how do you know which authors to choose from when you don't know the author? And somebody had told me, they said, pick the ones with the DD in front of their name. And he said, because these guys think, because they're a doctor of divinity. And so he said, pick those guys because they think. And he's right. Some of them have really interesting ideas. Some of them are ideas, and I read them and I think, wow, I would have never come up with that on my own. And some of their ideas, I think, you may not be wrong. You're not guaranteed to be right because it's extra biblical, but it's challenging. It challenges your thinking. And it would be nice if all truth was just laying out in front of us and we could just pick it up and put it into use. But truth just doesn't work like that. And it's funny you're mentioning this, because I was thinking about this whole idea and actually quite jealous, because I have a good friend of mine who he taught me how to program, how to write programs, he taught to code, and yet he also is into photography. And he is a avid outdoorsman. He's in his, I think he just entered into his 70s, and he's an avid outdoorsman. And I envy him, because I have a groove in my mind for years, a just very narrow groove of interests, of things. I've never been really interested in photography. I've never been interested in the outdoors at all. It's always been, technology and IT technology, fixing things. It's all, I'm like a one-trick pony. I have like one genre of life, and I really envy his ability to be able to develop. It was funny because he told me that he had made this backpack. He sewed it himself. And I said, you sew? It's like, you do photography, you're an outdoorsman, you sew? And then he tells me all these things. And yeah, I just bought this, I got a great deal on a metal lathe, and he's just everywhere. He's everywhere. Electromechanical, outdoors, nature. He works at an observatory. He's retired now, but he's still kind of emeritus at this observatory, and and goes in there and he'll code all night long, fix programs. He's trying they won't let him actually leave, because he's the only guy that can run the observatory, because he's the one who is familiar with all the old software that's running. And so to be able to have that kind of breadth is such an advantage in life.
Yeah.
Such an advantage in life. And I've tried, and he's inspired me actually to try to break out in some of these areas. Some areas I don't think I ever will. I love cement, and I don't think I'll ever love wood. And that's all there is to it. It's
you should take up sewing.
Yeah.
Or knitting.
Start there with sewing.
There you go.
But yeah, no, but being able to do that, and because obviously you have to be, if you're going to be learning that kind of thing, you have to be talking to somebody. You have to be getting taught. You don't just go get a sewing machine and just start running fabric through it and go, oh, that wasn't right. You're never going to learn how to sew unless you are being instructed. And so being able to be instructed, like Paul talks about, you have 10 million instructors, or 10,000 instructors. Would to God that everybody had 10,000 instructors, because then you're going to have a much better opportunity at truth. But if you're the kind of person who, you only read books by people that you agree with, you read stuff by people who disagree with you, and you just label everything as being stupid or off the wall, or, I'm familiar with all the sects of religion, and I may not agree with them, but I understand why they believe those things. It's just, you're those people. Oh, those people, I don't think of any of them like that. I don't think of it from that standpoint, because those people are, and this is always the case with errors. Error is always the extreme of a truth. And so how are you ever going to understand the truth if you don't understand both extremes? So if you're the kind of person who's always, I don't agree with this and that and the other thing, and you're highly opinionated against certain things, well, you only know one side of truth then. And so you are an extremist. You are not understanding truth. You may think you are, but you're not. You're on the extreme edge of a truth because you won't even consider the other side of the truth.
Do you think that this is one of the reasons why Christians are often called bigots? Do you think they've developed a like rigid reputation, or is this like or do you think if that's just a
I think it's a broad brush term, to call Christians bigots is a broad brush term, because it assumes, there are things that are assumed, and there may be Christians and vocal Christians who have communicated bigotry, but they don't represent Christianity.
Yeah.
They're not, and that's not me just saying they're not one of us. It's that's not the case. I know lots of people who have different Christian beliefs, and it's a rarity to find somebody who's truly bigoted in the true sense of the term. They're usually people that are mentally unstable, already. And I'm not saying, when you talk to them, they can't have a conversation. You talk to them for a little bit, and it isn't very long before, they're starting to tell you about how the world is actually trying to suppress this truth that only they know.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm talking about when I say that, is these are people, I've talked to people, and I can tell where they're going, because they're gonna introduce me to their revelation, but they want to make sure that they've got a good foundation, and so they start telling me about their experiences in Christianity and stuff like that, and it is long before they're describing experiences that nobody else has had, and it's not something that's common to Christianity, or even biblically common, or even biblically happens. It's, this happened to me, and that happened, the other thing happened, and what they're doing is they're just trying to build a platform to give their revelation. Mm-hmm. And so people like that, it's very easy, if when you run into people like that, if you are going to label them Christian, that there's a bigotry there, but it's not really a bigotry, because they're not opposing a certain cross section of society. They're totally out of society. They're not even a part of society anymore.
So let's talk about. Well, sorry, I have a question here that I skipped. Sorry, Kay. Maybe off topic, but we'll ask it anyway. God stands for truth and is truth, and He wants us to know Him. Do you think it's possible to know everything about Him in our lifetime?
No. No. I don't think we'll know everything about Him in the next lifetime either.
Okay, let's talk about, we asked this question kind of last week, but we didn't really, I don't feel like we got enough clarity on it. So I'm going to ask it again. Okay. We're going to ask the same question that Pilate did, but Pilate walked away. So we're going to stay here.
Okay.
We're going to ask the question, what is truth? But more specifically, is truth just about what's right and what's wrong? Is that what truth is? Is truth identifying right and wrong?
Yeah, anytime you ask a question like that, it's almost, is it binary? Binary questions are usually almost always no. But
On purpose.
the I wouldn't truth defines right and wrong, but I think it transcends right and wrong. It does define it, but that's only
pull
one.
Up the quote by Jordan Peterson here in a sec, huh? Yeah, keep going.
So the idea of truth, the truth will enable you to be able to determine right and wrong. That's the importance of truth, I think, is being able to establish that. And when I think about it from the standpoint of the Bible, it's when it comes to intellectual discussions about the Bible from a non-Christian perspective. I think I said this last week, is there's always gaping holes, to that are kind of put there on purpose to make Christianity look like it's a stupid man's game, that only stupid people believe in the Bible. But when you actually read the Bible, it will stretch your mind. It will take you beyond where you are if you're actually reading it to understand what the Bible's saying. And so I'm not even talking from the standpoint of some quest for truth. I'm just talking from the standpoint of if you read the Bible and you're reading it and you're trying to understand, from the perspective of the existence of God inspiring men to write this and putting all these pieces together. Another book that I actually just finished just before we started was this one I had mentioned to you before, the Confronting Christianity, and she deals with these big questions. And the final question is, why would a loving God send anyone to hell? And she the way she breaks it down, is just fabulous, just absolutely fantastic, because she basically says we would send a condemned criminal to prison. If it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter how liberal you're thinking, that if you believed somebody was a genuine criminal and a threat to society, you would have no problem with putting them away for life in prison to keep them from hurting other people. If you knew that those people were had the potential to hurt innocent people, you wouldn't think twice about it. But yet, when it comes to God, we don't want to cross that bridge simply because we don't like the idea of hell. That's all. We just don't like the idea that it's forever. But yet, our idea, this life, our forever in this life, is you're going to go to prison for life. So you'll always be in prison for the rest of your life. How can anybody see that as being okay, but hell not being okay? And I know there are people who are totally anti-prison, and okay, fine, that at least you're being consistent between that and hell by being anti-prison and not thinking that nobody should go to prison. But there's not a lot of people that think nobody should go to prison, that absolutely nobody should go to prison. And so but isn't prison, forever suffering in this life? Who'd want to live in a brick building?
Yeah.
And go out for a few hours every day, to just get a little bit of exercise, knowing that they're never going to have a wife, children, or husband, or family, or they're, going to, once in a while, they're going to have visits from people. We're okay with that, but we're not okay with hell. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, because because it becomes somewhat emotive. There's an emotional issue associated with it. And so, I think when it comes to, understanding the Bible, if you're willing to let your mind consider those possibilities, you'll see that it's a mentally challenging book.
Isn't there a vast difference between a dangerous criminal and someone that told a lie or didn't accept Jesus but isn't a dangerous criminal?
To who? That's the real question. Is there a difference to who? That's the real issue.
Mm.
And so, and it also has to do with your definition of dangerous. See, and that's the thing. It's a good question. I don't know who asked it, and I'm not interested in knowing. But the question itself really does show the root problem, when it comes to our understanding of things, is that is such a tremendous oversimplification of the facts of the matter, because we say it's only a lie. Well, yeah, but who decides that it's only a lie, and who decides that that lie is not dangerous? Do we decide that? There was a lie that was told, and now the whole world is suffering because of that lie. So is a lie dangerous or not? I mean, the whole world is suffering. In fact, everybody dies because of that one lie. So how? So I think, answer your own question. Somebody who tells a lie, is are they dangerous? Well, they condemn the entire world to death, on the basis of that lie. So I would say, yeah, they're pretty dangerous. Liars are pretty dangerous people, And then the idea of not accepting Jesus. What does that say? We know who Jesus is. Jesus is love. And so anybody who would not accept him, who would reject him, rejecting love, is that not a dangerous person? Somebody that would reject love. In other words, they are now capable of doing anything because their love doesn't govern their behavior. So we should just let them run free,
Yeah.
So that's what I mean is we oversimplify these ideas, by giving vague and can't, the words not coming to my mind, but just indulgent definitions. Oh, they may be a liar, but other than that, they're a really great person. It's like, well, you don't know that.
Yeah.
You're just saying that. You don't know what these people are capable of. And if you're talking about yourself, then you're in big trouble because you don't know what you're capable of. If you're able to lie and be okay with telling a lie, then you're a very dangerous person, because who knows what you're going to lie about? How far you're going to take that. It's not like lies, there's like, levels of lies, a lie is a lie. It's a violation of your conscience, your mind, the processes of thinking in doing something like that. And if you can violate that in a small way, well, it's only a matter of time before you'll violate it in a big way. Like truth, there's no stop sign, that says, okay, you can't lie you can't say this lie.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so that's the idea, is that's exactly what I'm talking about, is when you start to think about these kinds of things and think about the actual consequences of playing out these things.
So I was going to ask a question about salvation, but I think I'm going to skip that and talk about, since Jesus says, all who hear me, or all who are of the truth hear me. And we talked about this, or I mentioned this scripture as well in the last week's podcast, but he also says, I am the truth. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of statements made about truth, especially focused in the book of John. Anybody who's interested, curious, read the book of John and see how many times the word truth is written. It's actually pretty interesting how often the word truth is mentioned specifically in that gospel, as opposed to the other three gospels. I think it's only mentioned a couple times specifically in the other gospels, but the writer of John focused a lot on this, the words of Jesus when he mentions the idea of truth. And so again, leaning on this idea, Jesus is truth. All who are of the truth or interested in the truth, hear me. And this is the reason I came, to bear witness of the truth. or to the truth. Um, what is, when you join those two together, the idea of God, Jesus, and truth, what does that consist of? Does the question make sense? I don't want to be like super specific, but I don't want to be super vague either. So if I'm not making sense.
Try again.
Okay. So truth is talking about facts. It's talking about realities, laws of the universe, things that's just, those are facts.
Yeah.
And so if we're looking for truth, can you separate the idea? Because he's being really like, he's not saying I'm the truth of salvation.
Right.
He's not saying I'm the truth of
religion.
Religion. Yeah. He's saying I'm truth, and he just leaves it open-ended.
Yeah.
So obviously he's covering a ton of ground, right? So if we're introducing the truth to people, if we're saying this is the truth, what does that truth encompass? Is it is it like education separate, mathematics is separate,
No, see, so that's the thing is that, that idea. So everything has its origin in God. In everything. I mean, literally everything.
That statement is what originally inspired. You made a statement like that like 4 weeks ago, and that's what inspired these thoughts, actually. That's very interesting you say that.
Yeah, no, everything finds its origin in God. There was a point, and this is a thing that, regardless of what you believe, that you have to get your head around, because it's an established fact. Okay, is that time has a beginning, and in the beginning there was nothing. It doesn't matter whether you're an intellectual. Or whether you're a religious person, whatever your background is, whatever you believe, that is the starting point. Is there was a point where there was nothing and no time. And so everything that we have experienced has emanated. And this is, the whole idea of the Big Bang supports this thinking, is that everything emanated from a single source. Everything came from a single source. And so those who want to leave God out of the equation say that the single source was just nothing. There just was nothing. There is another theory that has credibility, but still is not quite covering all the bases, which is the idea that the universe has been for millions and billions of years expanding and contracting. So it's more like how a slinky works, that it's expanding and then contracting and expanding and contracting. But the problem is now you have a difficulty, because what you're saying then is that time keeps restarting, that the clock keeps restarting itself, and everything goes back to nothing, and then goes out to everything, and then goes back to nothing. And so that this has just been going on forever. Well, now you have a problem, because how do you start, the finite? How do the finite things start? And it's a the more you think about it, the more questions come than answers, and usually my experience has been that when you ask those questions, you're accused of being too narrow-minded, because not every question can have an answer. And so therefore, they're just things we just don't know. And it's like, yeah, but you've posited something without any real evidence at all, and expect me to base my existence on it. But at the same time, you're saying that I shouldn't ask questions about it either. So it's a real rough situation to be in. But no matter how you work this out, is everything started from nothing at some point, and there was a point where there was no time. And we know those are pillars. Those are pillars of fact. Those are truths. And so where did that come from? That, as far as I'm concerned, it came from God, and that's all there is to it. It came from God, according to, as the Bible puts it, God spoke, and then these things came into existence, which is actually humorous. I would say is probably the best way for me to describe it, is humorous, because the latest science is that everything that's in existence, and this is going into subatomic level, the lowest level that we are now aware of is that everything has as its foundation vibrations. And I laughed when I heard that. I thought, you mean just like Genesis said, in the beginning God said,
Mhm.
Emitted a vibration, and everything came into existence from those vibrations. And now we can dissect those things and find the vibration. And so, for me, it's just sensible. It's just sensible that it works this way. You have to really contort the evidence that we have in order to try to use another method of explanation. Whatever that other explanation may be, you have to leave bits out. You have to twist things around. You have to bend facts in order to make them suit the hypothesis. And so the idea that everything came from God, so now that's truth. Truth comes from there as well, because everything does.
So going back to my example about, times in my life where I'm committed to going a certain direction. Well, many people are going a certain direction, and that direction is not toward, even the idea of God. A lot of people have made a decision that I'm going to live like there is no God, and so they believe that, right?
Yeah.
How does someone, talking even from a very basic level, how does someone discover the truth?
Does somebody
At least
discover the truth?
starting place.
Well, like I said, because all truth emanates from God. It's funny because I'm pondering this in my mind, because for me it happened in an instant of time, and so I'm trying to explain something that happened in an instant of time in some way to try to be convincing, and it's really difficult to do because it was so easy. I mean, it really was easy. And that's why I was pondering this on my drive over here, this idea of, would a loving God send people to hell? And I thought, that's why I was able to find God, is because I answered the ultimate difficult question. If God is real, I'm going to hell and I deserve it. And I was able to answer that, that I deserve to go to hell, because I am in opposition to God and to God's word. I live in opposition to God and God's word. I'm not an activist. I wasn't an activist against God's word, but I was living in opposition to God's word. I knew that there were things that I shouldn't do, but I was doing them. And it wasn't that I knew God and I knew the Bible or anything like that. The Bible says the truth is written in our hearts.
Yeah.
And so I was what he says in Paul says in 1 Corinthians about those that are a law unto themselves, because I didn't have the law. I didn't have a Christian background. I was a law unto myself. My law was what I experienced growing up. That was my law. My law didn't come from church. It didn't come from a religious institution. It came just from the school of life and working things out in my own mind. But I knew I was violating those things, because there would be things that in my mind I would think, this is wrong to do this. And not because society said it wrong. I just knew it was wrong. I mean, like, probably one of the most, I think, significant ones was the issue of premarital sex. I knew it was wrong, but I had no evidence for that. I had no proof that it was wrong. I didn't even have anybody telling me it was wrong. My family, like I said, my family is a non-religious family. So the idea of having sex outside of marriage, this was never a thing. I was never sat down and said, don't get involved with girls or anything like that. It's not right. You shouldn't do this or whatever. It was nothing like that. I don't want to TMI, but there were running jokes in my family, even when I was 14, 15 years old, about, girls and being with girls and sexual intimacy amongst my parents, so so I had no moral boundaries, but yet when I actually engaged in it, something inside of me said, this is wrong.
Mhm.
This is wrong. But I didn't know why. It was confusion to me, because it was like, why do I think this is wrong when I have no evidence that this is wrong? And so that's why I say, when it came to Christianity and when I was confronted with Christianity, that's why I had no real problem saying, if God is real, I'm going to hell, because it was just very simple. It was just a very, very simple conclusion that I was violating my own conscience, and that must mean that there is an external reference, for what is right and what is wrong, and I'm violating that external reference. And if God is the one who's in control of that external reference, then I'm guilty and punishable. So and but that all happened in a probably less than an hour of pondering that whole idea.
Mhm.
It wasn't something that I really even struggled with. It was like, this is the facts. And so hopefully God doesn't exist, but if he does,
Yeah.
I'm going to hell. And so I really have a hard time understanding people who really wrestle with the idea of people going to hell. I really don't, because once you can see the reality of the fact that you're going to hell, it's not a real far jump to see that other people will go there as well.
Yeah. Okay. And sucks. I had a gone just like that. Okay, never mind. Was anything deeply rooted inside you before you accepted Jesus, or was it all
Deeply rooted in
deeply
what way?
rooted
Yeah, I don't know what that means.
before accepting Jesus, or was it just wanting to do whatever you felt like doing?
Yeah, no, there was no. Well, experience. There's I'm formulating a sermon on this, that out of the myth of normal, is that every one of us experiences trauma. Growing up, we experienced various traumas, and they define us. So I'm sure a lot of the decisions that I made were because of traumatic experiences, even though they don't register on my radar. But what was insightful to me about this book was, it was talking about people that, because this is written by a psychologist, and various conversations and with clients, clients are like, I'm coming to you because I'm having these issues in my life, and I don't, I don't know where they're coming from, and they would realize that they had a traumatic experience, some, sexual abuse and things like that. And as they would start working it through, they would break down crying and saying, I remember the whole thing, and I remember how I dealt with it. I dealt with it by saying, this isn't happening. So while they're being sexually abusers, this isn't happening. I'm out playing in the backyard, and everything's fine. And so they're reinventing reality, but yet in their subconscious is a violation, that's taking place. And they're, you can't unknow something. Once you know something, you can't unknow it. But they would build a whole defense around this, and then, like garbage in your garage, and just stick it on a shelf in the garage, but yet it's taking up space, and they can't figure out why this is taking, what is it? There's no space in my life, and I don't know why there's no space in my life, because they've got these boxes of things that they don't want to look at. And then going through, psychology, a session of with a psychologist, I'm not talking about the suggestions and people saying, I didn't even realize, I this had this horrible thing and my mom, and then it isn't true.
Yeah.
We're talking about things that were true. They were genuinely true. These were things that had come out later on and that were even, confirmed by, other siblings or things like that, and just, I didn't want to say anything, or even parents who, just decided they just wouldn't talk about it, just, this never happened. We'll just, trying to salvage this situation by ignoring it, hoping it would go away. But so my point being in all that is just that idea of, normal, and the idea of normal it really is relative, because it depends on what you've gone through, and so there's no doubt that there are probably things in my life, decisions that I made in my life and paths that I took in my life because of traumatic experiences, and they were just coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
Just to be able to survive, so, but it was, and so the idea of something being ingrained, or having some depth to it, probably, but maybe not at a conscious level.
Okay. So we're out of time, but I remembered what I was going to say is you're talking about your, your experience going from there being this kind of undertone of truth, knowing what's right and wrong, but not really knowing the evidence to that or why you feel that way. But then in a moment of time, settling this idea of, okay, no, hell's real, and I deserve to go there. And
if hell's real,
yeah, okay,
okay. So, that was the issue.
But
it was more of an equation.
Yeah, the fact that it happened in such a short amount of time should be really encouraging to the listener who is curious, that it doesn't take years of study for you to realize God's real and for him to show himself to you, right?
No, yeah, correct. Yeah, there doesn't have to be, a lot of time in between, but there really is. And having been a pastor for 30 years, it isn't easy sometimes because of life experiences. It isn't easy to be able to come to a place of openness like that, without a fear of losing yourself altogether. I had mentioned in a previous podcast that, that I'd had this revelation of being a loser, even before all that, that I'm a loser and it's okay. It was like several months before that of having just this sort of awakening in my life of realizing I'm a loser, but it's all right. And I don't know if that was, looking backwards on it, I don't know if that was, God preparing me for salvation, because I can honestly say that once you get over yourself, it becomes real easy to achieve, at all different kinds of levels. That's why I'm not surprised when I hear, of people that are extremely successful and then find out that these people have what is diagnosed as a mental illness. Mm-hmm. I think that's probably what made it so easy for them, because they don't have to fight with the nonsense that us, whole-minded people think. There's something in their mind that's broken that makes it easier for them to be able to get past the hurdles that we create for ourselves. A beautiful mind, the story of a beautiful mind, that the guy who's actually the character of that, he actually watched the video approved the movie before his death, and he approved all. He said, there was a few things that weren't exactly the way things are going, but it was online, and these were the things I was going through, and in his mind it was, if I don't pretend that I'm sane, then they're going to lock me up forever. So I'm going to have to pretend that I'm sane. And so in his mind, he's pretending to be sane by doing what other people do, but it's just an act. He's not doing it the way we do it, which is like second nature. It just happens. We just do it because we do it. He has to actually make himself do it. Yeah. And it's and he says, he said, there's a little article Wikipedia on him, and it makes that statement about him. He says, I believe that I would have not been able to do the research that I've done and the discoveries that I've made if I didn't think the way that I think. For him, it was a tragedy that being sane is such a limiting thing. So it's quite interesting. So and we're kind of getting in the weeds here a little bit, but the idea of knowing God is if you can get over yourself, and I can hear the sarcastic person. Well, you mean, so you're saying if I was insane, then I would believe in Jesus? Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. If you're insane, you would believe in Jesus. No, what I'm saying is that if you can get over yourself, if you can stop being so preoccupied with your own personality and what it would mean for you to give your life to Jesus and just work it out at an intellectual level, and a experiential level, just for the desire of discovery, it'll be much easier.
Mhm. Very good. Well, that's a great note to end on, and I think that was. Thanks for the questions, everyone who asked questions. Thanks for the comments. We appreciate that as well. Obviously, we will be doing this again next week. We would love you to come and be a part of that online, but we also have in-person services, and we would love to meet you and have you be a part of one of our services. We have a service tomorrow night. Be here at 6:30. Prayers are open an hour early for prayer. So we take time to pray before the services, but you can come and join us. I'm sorry, 6 o'clock. Yes, 6 o'clock. And then 7 o'clock, the service starts tomorrow night. And then Sunday morning, Sunday evening, we'll put the service times on your screen in a sec.
If there are any off-topic questions, because I was thinking about this, probably should mention this. If there was any, because I talked about the idea of doing the online thing, the after thing. And I didn't see a lot of feedback on that. So I thought maybe we should try to do this in steps. And so what we'll do is that right at 8 o'clock, and we'll give it a minute or so here. But, if there are off-topic questions, to take some time to discuss, then we will do that right as we finish at 8 o'clock. We'll actually do a second segment.
Let's
do it that way and say, okay, so now is the time where we're going to just kind of talk
open forum
at a more open, exactly, a more open forum type of a thing. And so we'll do that. We won't do it now because it's already 7 minutes into it, but but we will do that instead of doing the other way. Because like I said, it wasn't a lot of strong feedback about doing that. So I thought, okay, well, maybe it's not something that anybody wants to jump on and be live on the, to be able to be seen by other people. And so we can just do it this way, do it more at an off-topic thing. Yeah, exactly. And I think there's probably a lot of people that's how they feel, is the not wanting to be seen. And so we'll just leave it that way. We'll do it so at 8 o'clock, we'll do an 8 o'clock segment, that will go, basically we'll stop our topic at 8 o'clock. And then right after that, it'll be okay. And then we'll just go into kind of a sort of a casual discussion about whatever comes up, whatever questions come up during that period of time. And then we can do that for see how things go, maybe a 15-minute segment of that, and do it that way. And so
Sounds
you
good.
can go ahead then and go. We return you to your normal programming.
I mean, I've said everything so far. I think we're good. We're going to put the information for our service times, meeting times in person up on your screen here in a sec. But we welcome you to join us in person. Honestly, it doesn't get much better than that. You come in person, and like you just said, this idea of coming with a curious mind. I want to know, is this the truth? And God will show himself to you. And the truth is, that beginning realization really is quite sweet. It's not just like this, okay, I think I'm starting to get it now. It really can be quite eye-opening for you to know God's real.
Yep.
And be confident in it, and not like this assumption thing. Like you know God's real. And so we invite you to that. The opportunity is there for you. So more info on your screen in a sec. Find some resources for us on our YouTube page. There's a lot of good stuff on there. And then we'll see everybody in